In this week's In-Ear Insights, let's go back to our roots. I know we've been talking a lot about artificial intelligence lately, but one of the things that is so important is things like AI feed off of the data we already have, right? We have analytic systems of all kinds. We have Adobe Analytics, Google Analytics, Matomo. We have Salesforce and HubSpot, all these different marketing systems that contain tons of data. It's valuable data. And very often it's data that's not in very good condition. So sometimes we need to bring in outside help. We need to bring in a new team member, maybe a consultant, maybe an agency. And one of the questions that we get a lot is, how do I know who to bring on? And the sort of the unvoiced question is, how do I not know that they're not full of, as the Spanish would say, excremento de toro?
Jeez. I haven't heard that one in a while. And it's such an interesting question, and it goes under, why you should have a really strong hiring manager, which isn't for this episode, but to get a good understanding of what someone can and can't do, it's not enough to just say, hey, so you've worked with data before, right? And they say, yeah, of course I have. You need to dig deeper. And so the way that I like to approach that is to ask more scenario-based questions that you, the interviewer, already have a decent understanding of what the answer should be. So, for example, if I ask you, Chris, which is the better model to use, lasso, regression, pi squared, like whatever the model is, I don't know the answer to that question. And that's a really bad question for me to ask if I can't tell if you're BSing. But if I say, what is your favorite, like if I asked you to do an attribution analysis, what would be your first pick of a model to use? You're going to say, Markov or whatever. Again, I'm not going to know the answer, but I can then follow up and be like, help me understand why you chose that model versus something else. Our CEO is going to say, I just want to know the last thing someone did. And so it's in your explanation of, well, I would choose a lasso regression versus an A/B test, for the following reasons because of the validity and so on and so forth. And so it's really getting that deeper knowledge. You, as the hiring manager, don't have to follow every single part of the conversation. But if someone can't explain to you why they're making those choices, then it's pretty much a non-starter for me. So, Chris, as an actual analytics expert and not me fumbling through it with all of the wrong terminology, what are some of the things that you would be looking for?
It's going to be dependent on your system, right? So what does your MarTech stack look like? And this is why governance is so important, because if you don't have anything written down, if you don't even know what you have, then it's very hard to make a hire. It's like going into a kitchen, not knowing what appliances and what pans and utensils you have. And they're like, okay, we need to hire a chef. Well, okay. What are we trying to do? So this actually goes back, unsurprisingly, to the 5 Ps, right? What are you trying to do?
How that works.
It really is. What are you trying to do? The people, obviously, is the sort of the equation we're trying to solve for. Mm-hmm. You have processes written down and documented already. If you don't, that's probably important. And then what platforms do you have? And then what is the outcome you're after? And so this is almost kind of like algebra, if you think about it. There's a variable you're trying to solve for most. In hiring, it's the people variable of the 5 Ps. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have all the other components of the equation on the other side of the equation, so that you know those, because the last thing you want in algebra is a bunch of unknowns. And you're like, I can't solve this. Like x plus y plus z equals q. You can't solve that because there's not enough information. But if you have a variable and then you have your constants and your knowns, then you're in good shape. So let's take, for example, Google Analytics 4. Mm-hmm. That's our platform. What are the processes around that? Like, who's using the data? How is it being used? What answers are you trying to get? And then from there, you can start to ask questions in that process. Like, okay, you're an analyst and we have Google Analytics 4, and our executive team cares very much about where they're spending money. So talk to me about how you would do attribution analysis within the tool itself to
Mhm.
arrive at an answer of how to allocate budget and spend. And then the respondent's answer should be, well, which attribution model are you using within the tool? Are you using data driven, the time to event decay model? Are you using last click? What do you currently use? And is there a valid business reason why you've chosen that, or is that just what the product suggested and you just kind of went with it? That's how I would start to pick out a person's expertise, is to say, okay, well, what would you do to get to this outcome? And it's okay if they ask, it's ideal if they ask a bunch of questions back to you to say, well, what about this? What about this? I would actually be very wary of someone who's like, oh, yeah, always use data-driven attribution. Like, yeah, but you don't know anything about our business.
You actually just hit on, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is when you are vetting someone in the analytics field specifically, you almost always should get questions back before you get answers. A true analytics expert is going to ask more questions before they give you an answer. So, in that example, Chris, if you say, how would you approach attribution modeling within our system? They should absolutely be asking more questions before they give you an answer. That is a huge red flag, because just picking an attribution model, be like, well, you should be using last click. Or you should be using, time decay. Okay, but why? They should be asking more detailed requirements gathering questions in order to do the analysis. Very rarely, if ever, does someone have enough information right off the bat in order to answer a question with data. There has to be more exploratory. So you're absolutely right. If the person you're interviewing doesn't ask more follow-up questions to get more detail, then that is definitely something that you want to watch out for, because that does indicate overconfidence. That indicates probably a little bit of BSing and someone who's not going to really take care of your data.
Yeah. Even something as simple as like, how does your company make money? Right. That's a really important question. Like, how, if you've got an e-commerce website, that's very different than, say, a B2B company like us. And you're going to use Google Analytics in totally different ways. If you are a B2C e-commerce versus, say, a nonprofit, right? A nonprofit's going to have very different uses of Google Analytics. So it's even something as simple as that. Now, granted, you would hope that the candidate or the agency would have done at least some homework, like looked at your website, but it's still a relevant question. Just, it might be a deeper dive. So you say, okay, I've been to the Trust Insights website. It looks like you guys have got contact forms for this and that. So talk to me about what happens after someone submits a contact form. Like, what does that go into other systems? Do we need to see if Google Analytics ties into those systems? Like, it looks like you guys are using HubSpot. Do you have Google Analytics integrated with HubSpot? Those would be follow-up questions that I would expect someone to ask. It's like going to the doctor. Right? You say, doctor, my arm hurts. And the doctor's like, okay, it's time for surgery. You're like, whoa, 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 whoa. You should be asking some more questions first.
Well, even just a basic question, not even how do you make your money, but, what are you trying to understand with an attribution analysis so that I can give you an appropriate response? Because there's going to be different versions of that answer depending on what your goal is. And so if I want to know where people are coming from when they get to my website, that's going to be one version of attribution. If I want to know why people aren't staying on my website, or if I want to know, how many times, the contact form gets hit versus a newsletter, those are very different responses. So again, if you're trying to vet an analytics expert or an analytics agency, they should be giving you a lot of homework. They should be asking you a lot of questions that you're like, oh, I thought you could just answer this like with some data. Well, yeah, we can, but we need to know what the story is first, what the requirements are, what the guardrails are. If you are interviewing someone or vetting an analytics agency and you say, I really want to understand, our sales seasonality, for example. If they start talking about Twitter and you're not active on Twitter, again, that's sort of do you really even know what you're talking about? Or are you just trying to sound like you know what you're talking about? So Chris, without getting too technical into the, different kinds of models, machine learning, so on and so forth, what are some of the things that people, analytics experts themselves who are in the position of being interviewed, should be talking about? What are some of the questions that they should be anticipating, or if they're not getting them, they themselves should be asking?
So let me show you something. This is one of the migration templates we have. So this is for migrating to Google Analytics 4. You will note, and it might be a little bit hard to see. Let's zoom in a little bit here. You will note that the majority of this template, it's several pages long, is questions, right? It's not follow these. These are all the steps that I follow. It's like I need to know the answer to these questions before I can do a migration. One of the, I guess, green flags, if you go the opposite direction, one of the green flags to look for in a candidate, in a consultant, in an agency is, and I can't believe I'm saying this, standard operating procedures, templates, checklists, and
Yes.
things that provide evidence that the person or the agency has done this before, and that they have documented the gotchas, the things that are just going to go wrong. And so you have lists of questions and things that up front, like, okay, here's a good one. What agreements govern the account? Is GDPR an issue? Who is the DPO? If you go into Google Analytics and you just have a consultant willy-nilly checking things off, they are signing documents with Google on your behalf, and that can be a very, very bad thing. So even something as simple as that, which is not a technical thing, but it is a configuration thing, there should be questions in their standard operating procedures, like who is the DPO? Who has the legal authority to authorize an agreement with Google? And if those things are not present, again, that's kind of a yellow flag that maybe they haven't done this before, or they've not done it before in a situation where, say, like compliance is important.
Mm-hmm. And that's a big part of it. And I think there's a lack of understanding of the legal and compliance side of the data in an analytics role. And so maybe you as the analyst aren't necessarily worried about, is the data secure? Did we run it past legal? But those are things that will impact your role if they aren't done correctly. Or if you're not familiar with things like GDPR and CCPA, you may not be actually doing anything within your analysis that, worries about that stuff. But you need to know, I'm only getting a partial data set because of GDPR, or because of CCPA, or because of, PII. And that's just another piece of the puzzle that if you, the interviewer, aren't asking those questions, the interviewee should be bringing them up.
Exactly. And the good news is this stuff is not arcane. This stuff is not, mystical, never heard of. For all of the systems that are out there, these checklists and things already exist, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I'll show you an example. This is from Adobe itself. This is for Adobe Analytics, and this is basically Adobe's what to do when you've inherited an Adobe Analytics system. And this is a multi-stage spreadsheet that has resources, that has questions to ask. And again, look at this. This is all questions. This is not do this, then this, then this. This is, are you currently importing offline data? Are you leveraging a data layer for data collection? On the integrations, on the reporting side, do you know which reporting tools to use for the right use cases? Are you already leveraging data feeds? This is Adobe's blueprint for how do you audit analytics. And so I would expect any consultant or any agency that works in the Adobe ecosystem to at least have knowledge that these tools provided by Adobe exist, and that you have some variation of this. You might not use Adobe's stock version. You might have your own, secret sauce version, but there should be a version, and there should be a version that you feel comfortable sharing with a prospective client to say, here's the process we're going to use, and are there things in here that don't apply to your organization? And then are there concerns that you have that aren't addressed in the boilerplate version?
Well, and again, you bring up another really interesting point that I want to dig deeper onto is the process. And so, if Chris, you're the one being interviewed, and I say to you, one of the things we want you to do is run an attribution analysis on our Adobe data. My expectation is you would start to ask, like, well, what is your process for getting data out of Adobe right now? Is it automated? Do you use the API? Do I have to manually export things? And so an analyst that you're vetting should be asking, what are you doing currently before answering that question? Again, it's back to that exploratory. They need to know more information before they can give you a solid answer. And so, in that example of Adobe Analytics, so maybe they don't, have the deep knowledge that all of those documents already exist by Adobe. But if you're saying we work with Adobe Analytics, for example, as our primary, record keeping system for what goes on with our website, and we want you to run reports from there, they should start asking questions like, well, how often do you run reports? Are these reports automated? Do you use the workspace, or do you, create these reports ad hoc? How do I get the data out? How do you currently get the data out? Is there, security protocols that I need to figure out or be aware of or establish? Who has access to the data? Am I the only one who has access to the data? Do you have an auditing trail? When the data gets changed, who knows about it? Those are all questions that should be brought up, not by you, the interviewer, but by the interviewee, to get a better understanding of your system before answering, this is how I would do it.
Exactly. Yeah. How is this data being used?
Mm-hmm.
Something as simple as that, and understanding. This is something especially true for consultants and agencies. Understanding the implicit asks, right? So there's really three different fundamental implicit asks that when a client comes and says, we need some help with data. One
Mm-hmm.
is, hey, we need to save some time. Our team is just all over the place, and we're doing everything manually. We need help. Two is, hey, we want to make some money. We know there's some money in here. And three is, I'm a person in charge. I need to cover my ass and keep my job. Right? Those are the three basic asks. And understanding what the implicit ask is from the different people in the organization is going to really impact how you implement an analytics installation, how you do analytics consulting. Because if you are dealing with multiple stakeholders and they each have different priorities, how you talk about an analytics implementation, how you do analytics work changes, right? If there's what the person is just trying to keep their job, that's, you're going to do very different work than the person's like, hey, I need to make some money from this data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so again, as you're vetting and interviewing analytics agencies and analytics experts, these are the kinds of questions that they should be asking you. And so I do want to be clear, like, you're not trying to ask trick questions. You're not trying to manipulate the conversation. But you're basically setting up the conversation to see, does this analytics expert ask follow-up questions, or are they just going to give me an answer? And so you already know, as the interviewer, as the person responsible for making the decision, if the person I'm interviewing, if the agency I'm interviewing isn't asking more detailed questions in the interview, they're probably not going to once they actually start doing the work. Now, there are instances where that's fine, and it really depends on the level of expertise of the person, depending on what you need them for, sort of going up from, basic beginner, I just need you to do what's being asked of you as you're learning, versus an expert, which is what we're talking about in this instance. You need them to be leading the conversation. You need them to come in and know more than you about the data. And so if they're not asking the questions, they're probably not the right expert.
And I think that's a really important distinction as well, particularly when you're dealing with agencies. Is there's three levels of practitioner, right? There's the how, like how to do this thing. There's what is the thing that we should be doing, and then there's why is it we're doing the thing, and that corresponds really to execution, tactics, and strategy. If you are hiring an agency or a consultant or a professional for a problem, you need to be clear yourself. Am I asking for execution help? Am I asking for tactical help? Am I asking for strategic help? And the people who are brought before you need to fit your ask, right? If you are asking for tactical help and you get some strategist who's like, oh, I have these great big picture ideas about how to revamp your analytics strategy and your business strategy. Like, no, I just need help fixing this thing, right? Likewise, you might say, like, I need strategy, and you get somebody who's stuck in the weeds, like, well, which of these fit 22 buttons and features in your EVARs do you need to fix? Like, that's not what I need help with. I need help with how should I be measuring things in general, and that mismatch is really important. So part of your job is to be very clear, like, this is the expectations I have at the strategic level, at the tactical level, at the execution level, so that I know what questions to even ask of a candidate.
And that goes back to making sure that you are going through the 5 Ps, but then also creating those user stories, not only from your perspective as the hiring manager, but also from the perspective of the person you're interviewing, so that you can get a better understanding of what it is that you're asking. Back to that purpose, what is the problem I'm trying to solve by hiring this individual or this agency to do something? What is the thing? And you're absolutely right, Chris. You want to be clear on execution, tactics, and strategy, because those are very different skill sets. And the types of conversations you're going to have in an interview are going to be very different. So if you're looking for someone just to help with execution, then they don't need to necessarily be asking about, governance and legal, and that they just need to know, how often do you generate the reports? What is the frequency? Who are the users? The tactical is you start to get more into the, well, what are the segments? Are those set up? And so on and so forth. And then the strategy is, well, what's the overall goal for using this system in the first place? Why this? Why, these goals? How do you, make decisions with the data? So there's very different types of questions that you should be getting from an analyst, depending on what you're asking of them.
Exactly. And so all of this goes into, if you think about it, like we're saying, it's kind of like algebra. If you're trying to solve for a people, you need to have all the other things on the other side of the equation solved before the first interview. And if you don't have that, then you run the risk of not getting the right people, and not making a bad hire, or locking yourself into a consulting contract where you hire somebody and they do, because you don't have clarity for yourself, they don't have clarity, and then they just kind of do what they do. And we've run into situations with clients where there's been a consulting agency that is kind of doing stuff and making work that doesn't add any value, because it doesn't solve the problem of why they were brought in the first place.
Yeah, they're just trying to, quote unquote, establish value, but all of the things that are being generated aren't going to be used by anyone. And so there is a lot of due diligence that you, as the interviewer, decision maker, has to do first. Then you can start to bring other people on. It's a very common, I'll call it a mistake, because we've all made it, of, we're underwater, we need help, let's just get some people in to help us. And great, it's a panic move. It maybe solves the problem for a couple of weeks, but it's not a long-term solution, because you're missing that purpose. You're missing the people and the process and the platform and the performance. How do you know that this is a thing? Maybe it got us over the hump, but now what? Like, the panic is over.
But is it?
It's a different panic. The initial panic is over, and we've introduced 6 more layers of panic.
Exactly. And that's a ripple effect of making bad hires, whether it's a person or an agency. Is every person who works with your organization is going to have an impact on it in some fashion. And there can be substantial ripple effects in an analytics context. Let's say you're using Google Analytics, and let's say you've built a custom channel grouping for a channel, for channel attribution. A bad hire means that you have a bunch of data now in GA4 that you're stuck with, right? You might have a month or 2 months of data that is unusable because the configuration was wrong, and you can never get it back. Right? You can never retroactively go back and fix it. And so that person or that agency or whatever just kind of left a very obvious fingerprint that, like, oh, this is something that went really wrong.
Well, and to piggyback on that, it's also a really expensive endeavor to keep trying to hire over and over and over again. There's a cost associated with it. There's hard and soft dollars associated with, hiring, even if it's hiring contractors, even if it's hiring agencies and not full-time staff. There is a cost associated, and that turnover adds up. So you have your technical debt, you have your data debt, you have your data quality, but then you have the actual dollars spent on training someone, onboarding someone, offboarding someone, and so on and so forth. It adds up and it gets really, really expensive. And at the end of the year, you're no better off than where you started.
Yep. Speaking of money, let's talk about briefly, how do you know when to hire an FTE? How do you know when to hire a consultant, or how do you know when to hire an agency? Now, obviously, if you have budget constraints within the organization, like your organization says, "Hey, we've frozen headcount." Okay, well that makes it pretty easy. You can't make an FTE hire. You either have to hire a consultant or an agency. But Katie, in terms of other considerations besides budget and which pool of money staffing can come from, how do you decide? Yeah, we need to make a full-time hire versus we need to hire a contractor, or we need to hire a third-party agency.
I think it depends, honestly, back to the what are we asking them to do? Is it the execution? Is it the tactics? Is it the strategy? If it's just execution, then I'm pretty comfortable hiring a contractor because the expectations can be very easily set. The tasks can be time boxed, and you can put the guardrails and say, this is exactly what I want you to do. When you're starting to get into the tactics and the strategy, that's when you need to consider a deeper bench of knowledge. And that's not to say you can't get that with a contractor or a freelancer, but is this someone that if you're building out strategic plans, do you want to have them invested in your company long term? Probably. You want to have them be able to see the thing through. You want to have them grow with the strategy. If you want to have them own it, for example, or if you just want to have them weighing in. So you can bring in a contractor or a consultant if you have the team to build the strategy. They just need a little bit of extra color and expertise into it versus you need someone to build the strategy from the ground up. You probably want to hire an agency that can be with you long term as a partner, or someone full time who can really own and develop that institutional knowledge of what you're doing, what you're not doing, the nuance of your customers. That's harder to do with a contractor, not because they're not capable, but because of what you can and can't do with a contractor legally, in terms of professional development and those kinds of things.
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. It comes down to scale and diversity of knowledge. With an agency, you are obviously, the agency, you pay for whatever results you're getting, but behind the scenes, there might be one person on the account, 5 people on the account, 15 people on the account. And you as the client, you don't care. You just want the work just needs to get done. But having that capability in an agency allows the agency to scale to the account. Whereas again, with a contractor, they're a human being. So they can only scale so much, right. 168 hours a week is what is the maximum that an individual human being can give. But it also is that diversity of knowledge. If an agency has, even so, Trust Insights is not a huge conglomerate by any means, but even just having access to the 4 or 5 people we have on our bench is more than having any one of us as an individual contractor, right? Because our combined skill sets not only allow us to offer more in general, but it creates synergies that you can't get alone in one person, right? You and I working on an account is going to be a very different experience on that account because we have different skill sets that complement each other that neither one of us is good at alone.
Right. Well, and I think that that's also, when you're talking about one full-time person, one contractor, or an agency, the benefit of hiring an agency is that you do get that diversification of skill sets versus, bringing on one person full-time. Now you have that one dedicated resource, but they have limitations to their own skills. Sure, you can grow them, but that takes time. The same is true of a contractor. You have limitations not only of their skill sets, but even more so of their time, because a contractor tends to be working on other projects, other clients. You can do a contract to hire, but again, you're sort of limited in terms of scope and scale. And so there are definite benefits to an agency. The downside to that, because we need to make sure we're also covering that, is that, an agency, it's easier for you as the client to get lost if it's a larger agency in terms of what's reality and what are you being told is happening. Because, to your point, Chris, there may be 15 people working on the account, but you only ever interface with one person. So you don't actually have transparency into what's going on behind the scenes. Whereas with a contractor, that's easier. And so when you're vetting an agency, there's a reason why clients, when they're going through the proposal stage, they want to know every single person who's going to touch the account. But then if you start to see, as the person making the decision, wow, there's like 20, 30, 40 people listed, is that a red flag, or am I okay with that? Am I okay with never really knowing who's doing the work?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that it's a topic for another show, another time, about how value-based billing and stuff works, because I think that's a consideration with agencies as well. But for the context of this discussion, you definitely want to get a sense of who your team is and what skill sets they bring to the table. So if you were hiring an agency for, say, Google Analytics for help, and you look at the roster of people they have and none of them are certified, you think, that seems like a miss.
Yeah. And so there's definitely, again, this goes back to you as the hiring manager, as the company who's looking for the help, making sure you go through the 5P process and that you have a good understanding of not only the problem you're trying to solve, but the type of person or persons you need to bring in to solve that problem. And so that goes into, do they have, do I need them to have Google Analytics certifications, or is it okay if they don't? Do I need them to be HubSpot certified, or is it okay if they don't? Those are decisions you need to make ahead of time. And, it's okay if you change your mind in the middle of the interview process, but you need to have a clear understanding of at least the blueprint going into it.
Exactly. And those blueprints are, again, they're a good indicator when you're working with an agency or a consultant or even a full-time employee that person has done it before and knows what can go wrong. Because as I often say, and as I've heard from my many teachers and mentors over the years, the definition of an expert is not someone who knows things, who can do things well. It's an expert is someone who knows what's going to go wrong and prevents it as much as possible before it goes wrong. That's to me the definition of true expertise is all the ways this is going to go sideways.
And I think that that's a really good point to end on, is that your experts should have, if you're hiring a true expert, they should have been there, done that. And, they bought the t-shirt, and then they can tell you about the experience.
Exactly. It's no surprise that expert and experience have the same linguistic background. So we've covered a lot today on vetting an analytics firm, or vetting an analytics consultant, or vetting an analytics potential employee. If you have some thoughts that you would like to share about your experiences, either as the hiring manager or as the consultant or the person being hired, pop on by our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,500 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to the show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on instead, go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast. You can find it on most places on the internet. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.